Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton, and this week we are going to get into uncomfortable emotions. So when I first proposed this episode, I had a little bit of a paradigm shift because I actually proposed it as negative emotions. And Mark rightly corrected me and said, well, I don't think there's no such thing as negative emotions. I'm like, okay, you're right. But there are uncomfortable emotions because there are definitely emotions we don't like to feel, but it doesn't make them negative.
Yeah, I guess I never liked the word negative attached to emotions. And that I don't think it's just me. So I
Right.
don't want listeners to think, oh, this is a thing in psychology. I think there are plenty of psychologists who probably do refer to these emotions that we're going to talk about as negative. So this is a question I want to pose to you that wasn't on our outline. So I hope this does not take you by surprise. Most often, again, here's a generalization. When I'm seeing couples, it's often the male who doesn't see the point of being emotional,
Okay.
right? The wife comes in. This is a common scene for me. The wife comes in. I want more emotional connection with my husband. I want him to share, what's going on in his world. And the husband doesn't quite see the point of being emotional at all. And so the question that I ask is, and I think this can apply if you're religious and you believe that God created us, or if you're, an evolutionist and you believe that we evolved. It doesn't. I don't think it matters how we got here. Why do we have emotions? What's the reason for emotions? And often when I ask that question, people don't know how to answer. So I'm curious. Maybe I've asked you that question before, but what do you think? What's the reason that either we have evolved to have emotions or that we were created to have emotions?
So I can think of this both from a secular and a non-secular line of thinking, right?
Okay.
And so if you're talking about this from a form of religion, I think of we have to know the bad to know the good, right?
Oh,
We have to know sorrow, we have to know pain to experience happiness and pleasure.
well,
So,
I don't think that's a necessarily religious thinking. I think that's just a
okay,
philosophy that
okay,
that
sure.
as an atheist, I think that's true.
hmm
I mean, I believe that. So
Okay.
I believe what you're saying. I guess I don't know that I would necessarily attach it to either spirituality or religion. I think it applies to everyone.
Okay. And that's I guess that's the way I was taught, right?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
for every there must be an opposition to all things.
hmm
And
Okay.
right. And so now that could be coming from my own specific religion, or it could be religion in general that promotes that. I'm not really sure, but that's my understanding of emotion. But I also think that emotions give us information. And that's actually a thought I've developed since I've started with this podcast because,
Mhm.
I think even just 2 years ago, I would have said, no, anger, sadness, fear, those are negative emotions. Those are bad emotions. They're not. They're just a way to get information. So another thing that this makes me think of that is common that I heard a lot growing up. And I know I said this before a while ago on an episode about this idea in religion that we sometimes hear we choose to be happy. And so
Mhm.
what that phrase actually was, I misquoted that. It's we choose to be offended,
Oh.
right? And there is some truth to that. And I
Mhm.
remember when I first heard this, you choose to be offended. I'm like, okay, but what if somebody walks up to me and just punches me in the face? Like, am I not supposed to be offended by that? And so, what I've come to realize is it's not about the emotion that you're feeling that's the problem, because all emotions are valid and all emotions are important. It's how you handle that emotion. Because if
Right.
somebody is
Right.
genuinely trying to offend you, it's okay to be offended. It's okay to feel hurt and it's okay to feel upset. And so, I think what religion is trying to get at is how are you going to handle that? And I think that's important in a secular view as well, is how are you going to deal with this emotion? How are you going to deal with this hurt? Right? So
Mhm.
you have this unpleasant emotion. You can either stew on it and you can develop resentment and you can not like this person and you can give them what you might call free rent inside your head because you're just thinking about how much you don't like this person. Or you can say, this happened. I didn't like it. I'm just going to let it go. One way is much, much healthier in terms of processing and mental health. And so that's kind of where I think of emotions is, I think it's perfectly okay to be angry if somebody does something that's upsetting to you. And I'm
Hmm.
teaching my kids this right now. It's okay that you're angry, right? I mean, be angry. Tell me you're angry. You can tell me how angry you are. But what's not okay is for you to scream. It's not okay
Yeah.
for you to yell. It's not okay for you to be disruptive. And it's the same thing for adults. It's okay to be sad. I mean, you should be sad in some instances. And you should take the time to feel your emotions, but you need to find a way to process them and get back to a state of, I guess you might call it equilibrium.
Hmm. Right. So me, I'm an atheist, so I
Hmm.
approach it from a standpoint that we have evolved as a species
Hmm.
to have these emotions. And I think the reason, I mean, so I'm going to agree with everything you just said because I think it applies
Yeah.
either way, that emotions help us, they give us information
Hmm.
and they help us to take action, to survive, to avoid danger, to make decisions, and to understand others. And I think maybe the most important thing, this is my own bias, the most important thing the emotions do or can do is they can bring us together, they can connect us.
Yes.
And so if you think about survival of the species,
Hmm.
I think that emotions help us to survive
Right.
in a group or in a family, let's call it that. And in relationships, we've talked in many episodes about the importance of relationships
Hmm.
as far as being happy. But I think that in the case of these emotions, it helps us to connect,
Hmm.
to have that emotion. And so, when I find that couple, and usually it's the male who's saying, "I don't understand why I should be emotional," that's what I explain to them. I say,
Yeah.
"This is going to help you connect," and I try to help them see that what their wife is wanting in that moment is more of them.
Yeah.
I don't. They aren't wanting less of you. They are wanting more of you, just a different part that you may not be comfortable yet in sharing.
So I'm going to go out on a limb here and say they are emotional. They just don't know how to express it.
I agree with you. That is absolutely true. And, for a lot of them, they've learned how to suppress the emotion and keep it inside. In fact, my last client of the day, 56-year-old man who acknowledges this.
Hmm.
And this is a coping skill he learned. And so he wants to be more emotionally connected to his partner. And so that's why he's coming in to see me to learn how to do that.
Yeah.
So there's a reason that we have these emotions. The reason I don't like negative is that I think they are certainly uncomfortable for people, but
Yeah.
I don't see them as negative. I think there's a purpose to them. And so I think a lot of emotions are hard for people.
Yeah.
But that's the point. They should be
Yeah.
hard because the harder they are, I think the more likely it is to provoke some sort of action, on the part of the person experiencing that emotion.
Right. And so, if you think about these uncomfortable emotions or these emotions that we don't like. So, I mean, let's, for example, take anger. I mean,
Hmm.
anger is our body's way of telling us something unjust is going on. And so think of it in the context of a family, right? I mean, so when a mom senses that someone is going to harm her child,
Hmm.
there's a reason why we're referred to as a mama bear, because if you try to harm my child, I will dismantle you, right? Like I'm going to protect you. And so, I think fear and anger, but I think fear is probably the primary response there is, I mean, fear is so important. And I'm not saying that people can't feel fear in the extreme, right? So, I mean, people who have an anxiety disorder, it's a problem. But fear is so important. It's such an important emotion. Even though it's uncomfortable, it is your body's way of saying something is wrong. I need to either fight or I need to flee. So
Right.
fear is essential for that fight or flight response that we need.
Right. Fear it keeps us safe.
Yes.
But you reminded me of something that we probably should have talked about at the start, and that is we aren't talking about cases where someone has high anxiety
Yes.
and that it feels like the anxiety is out of control. The same thing can be true of anger. There are all sorts of anger management classes out there, and there are people who have not learned how to control their anger, and it is very damaging to relationships. So we aren't talking about those types of emotional states where it is out of control for the person. We're talking about, I don't know if you can, I don't like the word normal usually, but normal everyday feelings that one might encounter.
Hmm.
And so you mentioned sadness as well. And I think I I get a lot of people who come in and say, tell me how I can not be sad anymore. And so they want the sadness to go away, which I understand. But the first thing you have to really examine is what's the reason what is it that's making you sad? And so, I think you said these exact words, that sadness at times is an appropriate response
Hmm.
to different life situations. And I'll go back to the kind of the first thing you said. I think it really helps us to understand what joy is and what happiness is
Hmm.
as well, to have that experience of being sad. And I really believe that sadness is very different than depression. And one of my pet peeves is that a lot of people don't talk about sadness anymore. They flip right to, I'm depressed. And
Mm.
if you really looked at it, they're probably just sad. I think that I won't get on my soapbox today. I think that's a result of the drug companies.
Mm.
Because if we can get rid of sadness, everyone's depressed, I can sell more antidepressants. That's all I'll say about it. So I think that sadness, I think there are many times that we should be sad.
Oh,
And
yeah.
when people come in and say, for instance, I just broke up with, my partner of 5 years and I'm really sad. How do I get over that? And my response to them is generally, you wouldn't want to be the person who just broke up from a partner of 5 years and not be sad.
Yeah.
You don't want to be that person. This is an appropriate response to this particular life event. So it gives us information. And I think anger is it helps us to take action
Yep.
against some sort of problem. And often it certainly is a response to something that's unsafe, kind of like fear. But I think often it's about injustice as well.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so, we get angry about a lot of different things. And so, people who are out there who are fighting, say, for social issues, I
Hmm.
think they first start by being angry about it, by
Yeah.
being angry the way people are treated. And so it's that anger that then causes the, action.
And there are certainly times where it is absolutely just to be angry, right? If
Right.
there's cruelty going on, I mean, I think it's appropriate to be angry. Now, what's not appropriate is to say, and I'm just going to give example. Maybe someone is cruel to your child. That's going to make you angry, and you should, because somebody is intentionally being cruel to a child. What's
Hmm.
not appropriate is to take that anger and go try to get your own vengeance on that
Right.
person.
Right.
So again, it's the process, it's how you handle it. And I also think that, so going back to what you said about, sadness and depression, I wish that we could label maybe kind of what you're talking about, situational depression, because there are certainly instances where you might be depressed for maybe months at a time because something really sad has happened. So, I mean, maybe you did just get out of this relationship of 5 years. And I think people don't want to hear that the only thing that's going to get better is time. Nobody likes to hear that. They want an answer right now because we don't like this pain. I want this pain to go away. And nobody likes to hear the truth that time is the only thing that is going
Yeah.
to help.
Except with depression. So here's what I know I've mentioned this before. I think the common theme that I do see in people who are depressed is this sense, they all have this sense that either a part or all of their life is somehow out of their control. So I try and help them understand that the depression is telling them something.
Okay.
And the depression is saying, get control of your life. Get it,
Okay.
figure out. And I really believe that for many people, not all people, but for many people, the way out of depression is to look at what part of my life is out of my control right now.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next step is, what can I do? So here's the action. It's the call to action. What can I do that will then over time get me back into control of that part of my life? And so I think as a species, we hate being out of control.
Well, and I guess if you think about that, if like maybe situational depression, so like,
Yeah,
let's say somebody has died, you're
right.
going to feel depression if a loved one dies. In fact, you wouldn't, I think you said it earlier, you wouldn't want to be the type of person that doesn't feel depressed after a loved one dies, right? And
Right. But
so,
I do want listeners to consider it might be sadness and that there's a difference.
sure.
And
And
if we call it sadness, I really think it feels different. Words have meaning and words are
okay.
important. And I think one of the problems with depression, although we talked about this, we had an episode on grief once,
Hmm.
that I think if you have that long-term grief, I think it moves from sadness into depression. I
Okay.
don't know that it starts there.
Okay.
I
So
think I think that the response is generally sadness, but if you can't pull yourself out of it, then I think it moves into depression.
I'm curious, Mark, do you think maybe that, I mean, because I am comfortable calling it depression because I
Hmm.
don't associate depression with the need for medication. So I can feel depressed about something, and maybe I'm mislabeling it here, but I mean, I think you can be depressed, and you can be depressed one day and not be depressed the other day. And I guess maybe you're talking more in terms of chronic depression or clinical depression. So am I wrong here? I mean, what are your thoughts on this?
That's a good question. And I think the way a lot of people in mental health think about this, and I'd be curious to talk to you in 10 years to
Hmm.
see if your thoughts on how you define depression has
Okay.
changed. So clinical depression, I always think of those two words together. I don't say them,
Okay. Hmm.
but to me, they go together. And I think for us, depression is I have a hard time getting out of bed in the morning. I'm isolating from people. I don't want to go to work. I'm not exercising. I'm doing all these things. So you can be sad.
Hmm.
Say we're talking about, say, the death of a loved one. You can be really sad and you'd still get up and go to work. It wouldn't prevent you from carrying out those activities, and you wouldn't necessarily isolate. You might be pulled in a bit. But
Yes.
so in my mind, the symptoms or I guess you call the symptoms or the behaviors,
Hmm.
that's a better word, the behaviors associated with sadness and depression to me are different.
Okay. And I can see that. I can understand where you're coming from. And I guess, because I'm thinking of this more of something where it's like, oh, let's say your favorite TV gets canceled and somebody might say, "Oh man, that's depressing." Or
Yeah.
it's rained for 5 days straight and you're like, "That's really depressing." I guess, and maybe that's more of the pop psychology
Yeah.
way of thinking about it. And so,
Yeah,
and
I think that's true. Yeah.
right. Okay.
But see, if you're always depressed, you can always then be prescribed antidepressants.
Which I can understand that. And I mean, I'm with you there on big pharmaceutical, and we'll hold that soapbox off for another
Right.
day.
Right. Oh, I've been on it plenty of times here.
Yeah. Yeah. So I had this idea as we've been talking, and I want to ask you about what your thoughts are on this. And maybe this is a philosophical question, it doesn't matter, but it's kind of interesting. So anger in response to pain.
Ah, that is a really good question. So what's your question though? Because I've experienced that myself.
Everybody has. Okay, like, so I mean, for example, I don't know, if you stub your toe or if you do something, right, and something happens, or I don't know, like, the classic example I think of is you're trying to nail a hammer and you hit your thumb with the hammer. How mad are you in that instance? And so I thought that would be really interesting to talk about from a physiological and psychological. Why do we get so angry when we get hurt in those instances?
So I don't know about the psychological. I would guess there's a very strong physiological thing that's happening, although I don't know what it is. I'm just
Okay.
guessing that the pain, like hitting yourself on the thumb, that's pretty instantaneous. And I'm sure we could find this somewhere if we did some research that we would find out what exactly is happening in the
Hmm.
body. And I think that immediate burst of whatever it is, that happens with that pain causes that really the anger to flare. I
Okay.
remember I think I was cooking something in oil. and it came out at me, and
Yeah.
the anger, I think the dog was right underneath me, and I don't know that the dog had anything to do with me getting burned by the soil, but the dog got in front of my anger. But it was a flash. And
Uh-huh.
I think if listeners have experienced this, at least for me, what happened, it then recedes pretty quickly.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I had very quickly this thought, why did I do that? Why did I get angry? What was that about? And felt remorse about taking it out on the dog. But it was so instantaneous. It's got to be physiological.
Yeah.
I just know it is.
Well, I mean, and think of how many times that happens is, I mean, if somebody does something, you indirectly get hurt, you're mad at that person. They didn't do it on purpose. I would guess in your mind, in that split second, somehow your brain perceived the dog as responsible. The dog wasn't
Well, I did.
responsible.
I did. You're right, but I don't think the dog was. But
No, I
you're
doubt the
right.
dog was either. But that happens to people all the time. It's like, I've experienced that too. Someone's right there and you're doing something and you get hurt somehow, and it's like you want to just lash out at whatever's closest to you.
Yeah. And I think the reason that I so strongly believe it's physiological is if you think about being angry in a different context.
Yes.
So, maybe you're sitting listening to someone and your anger slowly builds.
Mm-hmm.
That, over time, that feels very different than that flash because I think the pain part, it's a flash of anger. At least that's how I've experienced. It's not
Yeah.
a slow build of anger, but it's immediate. And then from my experience, it recedes pretty quickly.
Well,
The
and
anger, the anger part, not the pain.
sure. Well, and not all pain leads to anger
Right.
either,
Right.
right?
Right.
And not
That's
all
true.
and not all instantaneous pain, right? I mean, because that instant, like it was an instant burst of pain. But if you think about it, if you have a headache that slowly builds on, you become irritable, but you don't have that flash of pain when your headache, like, right? Do you
Right.
understand what I'm saying?
Have you ever stubbed your toe though?
Oh yeah, and you're angry about it.
So see, again, I think it's that kind of it. I mean, there's a combination of things, right? It's not all
Hmm.
going to be all physiological, but I wonder if it's the unexpected nature of it that you.
Yeah.
So maybe this is the mental piece that if you're sitting in a room listening to someone and you slowly build, there's this mental piece that's going on at the same time.
Hmm.
But if you stub your toe, you have no opportunity to prepare or to think about it. It's just totally boom. I just stubbed my toe.
Yeah.
And bad words come out of your mouth.
Yeah.
My mouth,
Right.
not your mouth. I'm sure they don't come out of your mouth, but they come out of mine.
Well, I mean, and we have these instantaneous reactions that we can't always control, and fear and pain, I think, are really strong. So I have a good example of a reaction that I had little control out of. So I work in retail, and I'm putting out shoes, and I'm grabbing a pair of shoes, and shoes on the other end of the box start to move. And at first I thought just the shoes were connected, and then a mouse scurries out of the box. I'm on the sales floor and a
Uh-huh,
mouse scurries out of the box. I jump back and I go, "Oh, it's alive." That was my response is, "Oh,
uh-huh.
it's alive." And there was a couple of customers, unfortunately, that saw me. And my manager was like, "You really got to be careful about your reactions." And I'm like, "What do you want me to do? There was a mouse that jumped out of my box." Anyways, and so I think it's just the unexpected, it can bring out the worst of us. And I told a couple of other people that I work with about this story, and they're like, "Oh, you reacted great. I would have been screaming and cursing if a mouse jumped out at me out of the box."
Yeah.
Right. And so again, it's that physiological response. We don't always have control over it.
No, we
So
don't. We don't. Going back to that episode we did with on Robert Sapolsky's stuff
yeah.
and how we behave in his book called Behave I think is really an interesting read. I think
Hmm.
that maybe let me just, if it's okay, mention a couple of other what people might think of as negative emotions. We just
Yeah.
think of them as uncomfortable. Frustration. A lot of people really are uncomfortable with being frustrated. And so I think that what frustration does is it helps us to focus on a particular task or a problem. I think it helps us to be more focused. And so as I said that, what I wanted to do is mention this idea of narrative, which I've said
Mm.
before. So we all create narratives in our mind. So if we have that narrative that, say, frustration or anger or guilt or depression are negative, then that affects the way we feel about them and experience them. And so I think one way to change this is for listeners to think about changing their narrative. And so going back to the very first thing we talked about, that's why I don't like the word negative,
Mm-hmm.
because it kind of directs the narrative. Whereas if you have unpleasant, uncomfortable or
Mm-hmm.
unpleasant emotions, that's a very different narrative. And I think you approach the emotion in a very different way than if you think of it as being negative.
So, and you mentioned frustration and how it causes us to focus on a
Mhm.
task. So, when I think of something and I'm really frustrated, usually I'm thinking I need to step back for a minute.
Right, but I think that's a really good response, right?
Yes.
Because it
Yes.
helps you step back, your focus. I think you're doing exactly what frustration is supposed to do.
Hmm. Right. And so, again, nobody likes to feel frustrated, but
Mhm.
it's important. And it's important to acknowledge I'm frustrated about this because you can then say, all right, I need to step away from this, think about something else, do something else, and then I can come back to this issue or whatever this is with a fresh mind. And so you brought up another emotion that people don't like that I really want to talk about, and that's guilt.
Uh-huh.
And I
Right.
mean, guilt has probably got to be one of the most uncomfortable emotions to feel. And we've all experienced guilt. And I want to talk specifically about guilt versus shame because
Right.
shame is not helpful. We
No.
should not feel shame, but guilt is helpful because guilt, it's your mind's way of saying I did something I shouldn't have or I need to do something different in the future.
Yeah.
So, I mean, as uncomfortable as guilt is, we need to be careful not to let it turn into shame, and that's an individual process, right? And so, that's something that everybody has to work through for themselves. But as uncomfortable as guilt is, I mean, be grateful that you can feel guilty. And I know that sounds kind of backwards, but I mean, again, guilt, it's an important emotion because it's
Right.
your mind's way of saying something isn't right. I
Yeah.
need to do something
Or
different.
I did something wrong.
Yeah.
So, the difference, in simple terms, the difference between shame and guilt. Shame is you internalize it, meaning and you're thinking, I am a bad person
Mm,
because I did this.
hmm.
Whereas guilt is externalized and you're saying, I feel guilty because I did that. And
Yeah.
so, I made the wrong choice. So I agree. Nothing good comes from shame. I was going to say, I kind of like guilt.
Yeah.
I like it because I think it's helpful for people.
It
And
is.
this is the idea of changing the narrative. So if you go into this narrative thinking, oh, I feel guilty and that's so bad that I feel guilty, or you could shift it to what am I learning from this experience?
Yeah.
And then looking forward, I think in many cases, we ought to be forward looking and say, what will I do differently in the future?
Hmm.
Or how can I respond differently in this same situation? And you could say, so I don't feel guilty, or so I make a better choice.
And so I think oftentimes guilt, and not always, but it's associated with often our treatment or our involvement with others.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, I think if we feel guilty about the way we treated somebody, I mean, that's important, right? And
Well, it
and
gives
it's
you a message. I need
mhm,
to either make it right, I need to repair, I need to make an apology, and then I need to do something different. So it's really
yeah,
good information. This goes right back to my thing about connection,
yeah,
that I think it's really helpful. And if we respond well to these uncomfortable emotions, I think it helps often with relationships.
hmm.
Another one I wanted to mention was failure. I
Okay,
think that often people have a really negative view of failure. And I don't know where this idea comes from that we should never fail.
yeah,
I
school,
maybe, yeah,
yeah, yeah, the
you're probably
educational
right.
system, yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
we are trained from
don't
kindergarten
fail.
to get the right answer. Oh yeah, you got it right.
But if you look at, I think, I don't know if this is true for, I'm going to say every successful person. I think for the vast majority of successful people, what we often focus on is their success, and we don't realize all the failures that came
Mm-hmm.
before. Thomas Edison is a great example of this. I don't know how many times he failed with the light bulb till he got it right.
Mm-hmm.
But, so if he would have done 10, and I think it was in the hundreds. I mean, he really
Oh, yeah.
failed, but he kept going. And so he didn't have a negative view of failure. The way he saw failure was, what am I going to learn from this particular failure? That's just changing his narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think we can all look at failure in that way. What did I learn from this particular experience, and how can I do something different in the future?
So what we're talking about here reminds me of this concept that I've studied quite a bit since I went back to school, and I don't remember where this concept originated from. It's growth versus fixed mindset,
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
which and that sounds like this narrative, right?
Yeah.
And these emotions, these uncomfortable emotions that we're feeling that we don't like. If you have a fixed mindset, you're going to internalize those emotions. So you're going to internalize your guilt, and it's going to become shame. You're going to internalize your anger, and you're going to become a bitter person. Whereas if you have a growth mindset, you're going to look at these emotions and you're going to think, okay, what information am I getting with these unpleasant emotions, and how can I get back to a state of equilibrium? And I
Yeah.
think I just like that term, state of equilibrium. I use it to describe my kids when they're dysregulated, when they're emotionally dysregulated and they're exploding. And there's been several times where, I've said to Curtis, because he's like, what's going on? And I'm like, I don't know, pick a reason and go with that one. Because
Well, I like the term too. I really
yeah,
do. I
yeah.
think it can be applied to everyone, although Lindy
Mhm.
certainly uses it in terms of children. She
Yeah.
always thought that there were certain ages that children moved into stages of disequilibrium and
Yeah.
equilibrium. And I think it's a normal developmental piece. But
Mhm.
I really agree with what you're saying, that as adults, one of the things we should learn as children so that we can take it into adulthood is, how can we pull ourselves back
Mhm.
into equilibrium so that we don't stay in that state of disequilibrium? And I know we probably all know people who have a very hard time getting out of that state as
Yeah.
adults, getting out of that state of disequilibrium.
Yeah.
I always try to think of a takeaway for our listeners. And I think one of the takeaways is that it really is in the title of the episode, uncomfortable emotions as opposed to negative emotions. And I think changing your narrative about how you see these will help you then to look for the information that these uncomfortable emotions are giving you, which then hopefully could lead to some sort of action.
Yeah. And at least get you back to a state of, I mean, I don't want to say happiness, because sometimes it can be very hard for people to feel happy, but I guess what we called it, that state of equilibrium, a point where you at least feel like you are moving forward, where a better
Yeah.
place, right? So where you feel like you're just emotionally and mentally, you're in a better state.
Well, I think probably you have to pass through equilibrium or be in equilibrium in order to get to happiness.
Yeah.
It's probably a necessary step.
Yeah. Yeah. I think so. All right. So next week, we're going to swing back into our favorite topic, relationships, and we're going to talk about marital myths. So I think that's going to be a fun episode, and we will see you all next week.
Have a good week, everyone.
Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.